"You are a liar." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the flat, chilling finality of a spade striking frozen earth. They sliced through the cloying air of the morning room, a room suffocated by the scent of wilting roses and old beeswax, and landed in the space between the Duke of Blackwood and his wife. Alistair stood rigid, his form a monolith of tailored wool and righteous fury. Before him, Eleonora seemed to shrink, her hand still resting on the back of a silk damask chair, as if for balance. The morning light, usually so kind to this room, was merciless. It caught the single tear that traced a path through the fine powder on her cheek, leaving a glistening, ruinous track. It illuminated the tremor in her pale hands and the way the pearls at her throat seemed to choke her. He felt a savage, ugly satisfaction at her silence. It was an admission of guilt, a confirmation of the poison his cousin Marcus had so carefully dripped into his ear for months. The whispers of her melancholy, her artistic sensibilities, her long, quiet afternoons. It had all been a lie, a beautifully constructed cage of deceit from which she had conducted her sordid affairs. The scene he had just witnessed, or rather, the scene Marcus had ensured he witnessed. Eleonora's hand on the arm of that preening, paint-stained artist, their heads bent close together in supposed conspiracy, was merely the final, damning proof. "I gave you everything," Alistair said, his voice a low grind of crushed stone. "My name, this house, a life of unimpeachable honor, and you soiled it." Eleonora finally looked up. Her eyes, the color of a winter sea, were not filled with the pleading or terror he had expected. They were hollowed out, empty of all emotion save for a deep, abyssal coldness that mirrored his own. The sight of it was a shock, a splash of icy water that momentarily cut through his rage. He had expected hysterics, denials, a woman's frantic defense. He had not expected this void. "You believe him," she stated, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried across the suffocating silence. It was not a question. It was a verdict. "I believe the evidence of my own eyes," he countered, the fury roaring back to life, fueled by that flicker of uncertainty she had ignited. "I saw you with him. Do not insult my intelligence by denying it." A strange, brittle smile touched her lips, a thing of horrifying fragility. "Your eyes? Or his?" she asked, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod towards the doorway, where Marcus surely lingered, savoring his victory. "You have never once used your own eyes to truly see me, Alistair. You see a duchess, a decoration, a vessel for the next Duke of Blackwood. You do not see a person. Why would you start now?" The accusation struck a nerve he did not know he possessed. It was absurd. He saw her every day. He saw the gown she wore, the jewels he purchased for her, the perfect, serene mask she presented to the world. He saw the Duchess. What else was there to see? "Enough," he snarled, the word a physical blow. "You will be confined to your rooms until I decide what is to be done. You will not bring further shame upon this house." He turned on his heel, the sharp click of his boots on the polished parquet flooring, echoing the shutting of a tomb. He did not look back. If he had, he would have seen the last flicker of light in her eyes extinguished completely. He would have seen her straighten her spine, her chin lifting not in defiance, but in a profound and terrible resignation. He would have seen the Duchess of Blackwood die, and a survivor begin to take her place. The gilded cage had finally sprung its trap, but the bird within was not broken, not yet. It was simply learning the silence of the grave, and in that silence it was planning its flight. That night, the manor was a mausoleum of whispers. Eleonora sat before her vanity, the silver-backed brush heavy in her hand, her reflection a pale ghost in the candlelight. The room was a testament to Alistair's wealth and his ignorance. Silks from the Orient, porcelain from Meissen, carpets from Persia. They were all beautiful, all priceless, and all utterly cold. They were things. She was a thing. She had not cried again. The single tear in the morning room had been the last of them, a final offering to the woman she had been. Now a strange calm descended. It was the calm of the sailor who, having lost the mast and rudder in a storm, simply lets the waves take him. The fight was over. The marriage was a lie, a hollowed-out gourd painted to look like fruit. Her husband, the man she had once foolishly believed she might grow to love, was a stranger who preferred the counsel of a viper to the word of his own wife. Her hand drifted from her hair to the slight, almost imperceptible swell of her abdomen, hidden beneath the tight lacing of her corset. A life, a secret, her secret. This was not about her honor anymore. It was about the survival of the child growing within her, a child who would be born into a house of lies and suspicion, forever tainted by a scandal that was not of its mother's making. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. She stood, moving with a newfound purpose that felt alien in her own limbs. She went to the immense, carved wardrobe and pushed aside the rustling silks and velvets. At the very back, behind a row of winter cloaks, was a simple traveling dress of dark, sturdy wool. It had been her mother's, kept for sentiment. Now it was her salvation. She unlaced the suffocating corset, gasping as her lungs filled properly for the first time in hours. She shed the Duchess's skin, the silk chemise, the lace-trimmed petticoats, the gown of shimmering brocade. She dressed in the plain wool, the fabric coarse against her skin, a welcome, grounding friction. On the vanity, the Blackwood diamonds glittered like chips of ice, a king's ransom. She looked at them, at the necklace Alistair had clasped around her throat just last week, his fingers cool and impersonal. They were shackles, not adornments. She swept them with the back of her hand into a velvet-lined box and shut the lid. From a small, hidden drawer in her writing desk, she retrieved a leather pouch. It contained the last of her dowry, a modest sum she had kept for herself, a tiny piece of her old identity. It felt heavier than all the diamonds combined. It was the weight of freedom. She penned no note. There were no words left to say. Explanations were for those who might be listened to. She was beyond that now. Slipping through the darkened, silent corridors of the manor was like navigating a dream. The portraits of Alistair's ancestors watched her with cold, painted eyes. They were judging her, condemning her, these grim-faced men and sallow-skinned women who had built this dynasty on pride and stone. She felt no fear of them. They were ghosts, and she was about to become one herself. She used the servants' stairs, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the worn stone. The air grew cooler, smelling of scrubbed floors and baking bread from the kitchens below. It was the smell of honest work, a world away from the cloying perfumes of the upper floors. A single, loyal lady's maid, Mary, met her at a small postern gate, her face a mask of worry in the moonlight. Mary, who had seen the kindness in Eleonora that others missed, who had witnessed Marcus's subtle cruelties. A small, heavy bundle was pressed into Eleonora's hands. Bread, cheese, and a flask of water. "Godspeed, my lady," Mary whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I am not a lady anymore, Mary," Eleonora replied, her own voice steady, clear. "I am just Ellen." She slipped through the gate and into the night. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky. She did not look back at the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor. She walked towards the distant road, each step taking her further from the gilded cage and deeper into the terrifying, unknown wilderness of a new life. The only thing she carried of her past was the secret life within her, a tiny, flickering flame she would protect with her very last breath. 5 years passed. 5 years of grinding toil, of calloused hands and an aching back, of learning the rhythm of the seasons not from a drawing-room window, but from the very soil itself. 5 years of becoming Ellen. The coastal village of Porthgarrow in Cornwall, was a world away from the manicured lawns of Blackwood. Here the wind was a constant, scouring presence, tasting of salt and fish and damp stone. The cottages clung to the cliffs like barnacles, their slate roofs gray against a gray sky. Eleonora, Ellen, had bought a small, derelict cottage with the last of her money. It had a leaky roof, a smoking chimney, and a patch of land choked with gorse and brambles. She had clawed it back from the wild. She had learned to mend the roof, to mix mortar, to plant potatoes and coax cabbages from the reluctant, sandy soil. She sold her surplus vegetables and jars of glistening jam at the weekly market, her face shielded by a simple bonnet, her voice quiet but firm as she bartered with the locals. They knew her as the quiet widow, Ellen, a woman with a past she never spoke of, and a fierce, almost savage devotion to her young son, Arthur. He was the sun that had risen in her dark world, a whirlwind of scraped knees, endless questions, and bright, startling laughter. He had her quiet determination, but he had his father's eyes. Gray, clear, and serious, they were a constant, painful reminder of the man who had cast them out. Sometimes, when Arthur looked at her with a particular, solemn intensity, her breath would catch in her throat. It was like looking at a ghost. Her life was a simple, exhausting routine. Rise before dawn, milk the goat, tend the garden, mend their clothes, cook their simple meals. There was no room for melancholy, no time for bitterness. There was only the work and Arthur. The physical exhaustion was a balm, scouring her mind clean of the past. Her body, once soft and pampered, was now lean and strong. Her hands, which had only ever known the feel of silk and ivory, were now mapped with the story of her survival. Ferrars, meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Blackwood Manor was slowly dying from the inside out. On the surface, nothing had changed. The lawns were immaculate, the silver polished to a blinding sheen, the staff moving with silent, fearful efficiency, but the soul of the house was gone. Duke Alistair of Blackwood had plunged himself into his work with a punishing ferocity. He managed his vast estates, sat on parliamentary committees, and oversaw his many investments. He was richer and more powerful than ever. And he was utterly, profoundly miserable. The silence Eleonora had left behind had become a living entity in the house. It coiled in the empty corridors, sat opposite him at the long, gleaming dining table, and lay beside him in the vast, cold bed. He had expected relief after her departure, the clean severing of a diseased limb. Instead, he found a phantom ache that never subsided. His cousin Marcus was a constant presence, his voice a smooth, reasonable poison. He had arranged a few potential new brides, sensible women from good families with impeccable bloodlines. Alistair had met them with a crushing apathy. They were all pale copies of what he had thought he wanted, and their simpering perfection only served to highlight the vibrant, intelligent woman he had thrown away. Doubt, once a tiny, insignificant seed, had taken root in the barren soil of his heart and grown into a thorny, suffocating vine. It had started with small things. The disgraced artist, Farringdon, had not faded into obscurity as expected. Instead, his career had flourished. He was lauded in London for his talent, but more so for his unimpeachable character, a man known for his quiet piety and devotion to his invalid sister. It did not align with the portrait of a seducer Marcus had painted. Then, a year ago, the old housekeeper, Mistress Gable, had confessed on her deathbed. With a rattling breath, she had admitted to being paid by Marcus to move the time of Eleonora's meeting with the artist, to ensure the door was left ajar, to place a half-empty bottle of brandy on a nearby table, to suggest a lover's tryst. She had been terrified of the Duke. She'd wheezed, but more terrified of Mr. Marcus. The confession had shattered Alistair's carefully constructed reality. The rage he had felt that day 5 years ago was nothing compared to the cold, sick horror that now consumed him. He had been a fool, a proud, arrogant, blind fool. He had been a puppet, and Marcus the master. pulling the strings of his pride and insecurity. He began his own investigation, a secret, meticulous crusade. He hired a discreet agent from London, a man named Finch, with the eyes of a hawk and the tenacity of a terrier. They unraveled Marcus's web of lies with terrifying speed. Financial records showed payments not only to Mistress Gable, but to 2 footmen who had sworn they'd seen clandestine meetings. They found the stable boy who had been paid to deliver a forged, intimate-sounding note from Eleonora to the artist's studio, a note Farrington, confused, had thankfully kept. The final, devastating blow came from a retired midwife in the village bordering the estate. Finch located her, and she tearfully recounted how the Duchess had secretly visited her weeks before her departure, her face pale with worry. She had confirmed the Duchess was with child. A child. His child. The knowledge did not come as a wave of grief, but as a physical collapse. Alistair had locked himself in his study for 2 days, the curtains drawn, refusing all food and company. He stared at the portrait of Eleonora that hung over the mantelpiece, a painting commissioned in the first, hopeful months of their marriage. The artist had captured her quiet intelligence, the hint of a sad smile, the deep, soulful light in her eyes. He had looked at this painting every day for 5 years and had seen nothing. Now he saw everything he had lost. His blindness had not just cost him a wife, it had cost him his child. The hunt for Eleonora became his obsession. It was no longer about reclaiming a duchess. It was about finding the woman he had wronged and the child he had never known. Finch's search was painstaking, following cold trails and whispered rumors. Finally, after months of dead ends, a name surfaced. A quiet widow named Ellen, living in a remote Cornish village, who had arrived 5 years ago with nothing, and had a young son with startlingly familiar gray eyes. Alistair rode for Cornwall himself, leaving the running of the estate in the hands of a trusted steward, and leaving Marcus in a state of blissful ignorance. The journey was a pilgrimage of penance. With every mile that passed, the manicured landscapes of his world gave way to something wilder, more rugged, more real. It felt like he was traveling not just across the country, but into a different reality. He arrived in Porthgarrow on a blustery afternoon. The village was even smaller and more weather-beaten than he had imagined. He left his horse at the small, grim-looking inn and walked, his fine leather boots entirely out of place on the cobbled, uneven track that led towards the cliffs. Finch's directions were precise. The last cottage before the path dwindled to nothing. He saw it from a distance, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a small defiant outpost against the vast, churning sea. And then he saw her. She was in the garden, her back to him, bending to pull weeds from a patch of earth. She wore a simple, faded blue dress, and her glorious auburn hair, which he had only ever seen in elaborate coiffures, was tied back in a simple, practical braid. She was thinner, her skin tanned by the sun and wind, but she moved with a fluid strength that was entirely new. As he watched, a small boy with a mop of dark hair ran out of the cottage, chasing a chicken. She straightened up, laughing, and the sound carried on the wind, a bright, clear note that pierced Alistair's heart. This was not the broken, destitute creature of his guilty imagination. This was a woman who had built a life from the ashes of the one he had destroyed. The sight of her resilience, her survival, was more humbling than any accusation could ever be. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. He started walking again, his steps slow, deliberate. The air grew thick in his lungs. What could he possibly say? How could he bridge the chasm of 5 years of pain and betrayal? He reached the low stone wall that marked the edge of her property. A simple wooden gate stood slightly ajar, and standing just inside it was the boy. Arthur had stopped chasing the chicken and was now watching the tall, dark-clad stranger with an unnerving, solemn gaze. His face was smudged with dirt, his small tunic patched at the elbow. But his eyes, they were a perfect, shattering reflection of Alistair's own, the Blackwood eyes. staring at him from the face of a son he had never met. Alistair froze, his hand resting on the cold stone of the wall. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All the carefully rehearsed speeches, all the justifications and explanations, evaporated into the salt-laced air. There was only this small boy, this living, breathing testament to his failure. The boy tilted his head, his gaze dropping to the heavy gold locket Alistair wore, a family heirloom containing a miniature portrait of his own stern-faced father. The boy's expression was one of simple, childish curiosity. "Are you the portrait man?" Arthur asked, his small voice clear and piping above the cry of the gulls. The innocent question struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He was a portrait man, a man from a long line of portraits, a man who lived in a house full of them, a man who had stared at a portrait of his wife for 5 years without ever truly seeing her. He was a flat, two-dimensional figure from a world of wealth and privilege, stepping into the vibrant, hard-won reality of theirs. Before he could formulate an answer, a shadow fell across the path. "Arthur, come away from the gate." The voice was low, taut, and stripped of all warmth. Eleonora stood there, a hoe held loosely in one hand, her body a rigid line of defiance. Her eyes met Alistair's across the short distance, and in them he saw not shock or fear, but a dawning, terrible recognition, followed by a wave of pure, undiluted hatred that was so intense it felt like a physical heat. "You," she breathed, the word a curse. She moved swiftly, pulling Arthur behind her skirts, her body a shield between her son and the ghost from their past. "Eleonora," he began, his voice rough, unfamiliar in his own ears. "Do not speak my name," she snapped, her knuckles white where she gripped the wooden handle of the hoe. "It is not yours to use. Nothing here is yours to touch." "I had to find you," he said, taking a half-step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace that felt utterly inadequate. "Why?" she shot back, her voice laced with a bitter, corrosive venom. "Did you grow weary of your solitude? Did your cousin finally bore you with his sycophantic drivel? Have you come to finish the job, Your Grace? To cast us out from this hovel as you cast me out from my home?" The formal title was a slap in the face. It erected a wall of ice and protocol between them, a reminder of the power imbalance he had once wielded so cruelly. "No," he said, his voice raw. I came because I was wrong. I was a fool. I was deceived." She let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Deceived? You were not deceived, Your Grace. You were merely given the excuse you always wanted, the excuse to believe the worst of me. It was so much easier than trying to understand me, was it not?" From behind her, Arthur peeked out, his gray eyes wide with confusion, looking from his mother's tense form to the tall, sad-faced man at the gate. "Mama," he whispered, "who is the man?" Eleonora's entire body flinched, as if struck. She gently pushed her son towards the cottage. "Go inside, Artie. Now." The boy hesitated, then obeyed, casting one last, curious glance over his shoulder before disappearing through the doorway. Once he was gone, Eleonora's composure seemed to crack, but it was not tears that emerged. It was a cold, righteous fury. "You will leave," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. "You will get back on your fine horse, and you will ride away from this place, and you will never, ever return. You have no right to be here. You have no right to look at him." "He is my son," Alistair whispered, the words tasting of ash. "He is my son," she countered, taking a step forward, the hoe held now like a weapon. "I am the one who carried him in secret, terrified you would find out and take him from me. I am the one who gave birth to him in a rented room with only a midwife for company. I am the one whose hands have fed him and clothed him and held him when he was sick. You forfeited the right to call him your son the day you called his mother a whore." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking deep into the heart of his guilt. There was no defense against the truth of her pain. "I know about Marcus," he said, desperate to make her understand. "I have proof, affidavits, financial records. He orchestrated the entire thing." "I do not care about your proof," she said, her voice weary, all the fight suddenly draining out of her, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "It changes nothing. The core of it remains. You did not trust me. You did not know me. You did not love me. You believed a lie because it was easier than believing in me. That is the truth that no amount of proof can ever erase. Now please, I am begging you, leave us in peace." She turned and walked back to the cottage, her shoulders slumped. She did not look back as she closed the door, the soft click of the latch echoing in the sudden, crushing silence. Alistair stood at the gate for a long time, the wind whipping at his coat, the cries of the gulls mocking him. He was the Duke of Blackwood, a man whose will was law, whose wealth could buy armies, and he had been dismissed. He had been defeated by a closed wooden door and the unassailable truth in a woman's eyes. He could leave. He could ride away and consign them to this life, salving his conscience with a generous anonymous allowance. It would be the easy thing to do, the sensible thing. It was what the old Alistair would have done. But the old Alistair had died in his study 2 months ago, staring at a portrait of his wife. He would not leave. He turned from the gate and walked back towards the grim little inn. He had come here for absolution, but he knew now it was not something she could give. It was something he would have to earn, and if it took the rest of his life, he would stay. Penance had begun. Alistair secured a room at the Salty Dog, a place that smelled of stale ale, damp wool, and fried fish. The innkeeper, a stout man with a suspicious squint, looked at Alistair's fine clothes and quoted a price that was nothing short of extortion. Alistair paid it without haggling, also paying for a week's silence about his presence. He then rented a small, disused fisherman's cottage at the edge of the village, a hovel with a perpetually damp floor, and a view of Eleonora's cottage on the distant cliff. He moved in with nothing but a satchel of clothes and the heavy box of evidence he had brought with him. The discomfort was a welcome punishment. The cold that seeped through the stone walls felt like a fitting penance for the coldness he had shown her. He spent the first days simply watching, observing the rhythm of her life from afar. He saw her rise with the sun, her silhouette moving past the single window. He saw her working in the garden, her movements economical and strong. He saw her walking with Arthur along the cliff path, pointing out seabirds, her hand resting on his small shoulder. He saw a life that was complete, a small, perfect world that he had no place in. It was both beautiful and agonizing to witness. He knew grand gestures would be rejected. He could not shower her with money or jewels. That would be an insult to the independence she had fought so hard to win. He had to find another way. He had to use his hands, not his title. His first act was small. He noticed that a section of the stone wall around her garden had crumbled, leaving her vegetable patch vulnerable to the wild rabbits that populated the cliffs. He waited until she and Arthur had gone to the market in the next town over. Then he walked to her cottage, the unfamiliar weight of tools borrowed from the innkeeper heavy in his hands. The work was brutal. His hands, accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a pen or the reins of a thoroughbred, were quickly blistered and raw. The stones were heavy, awkward, and sharp. But as he worked, meticulously fitting the stones back into place, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He was not ordering a thing done. He was doing it. He was mending something he had broken, if only metaphorically. By the time she returned at dusk, the wall was restored, solid and strong. He was gone, watching from his window as she stopped, stared at the wall, her expression unreadable, before ushering Arthur inside. He did not approach her. He waited. A week later, a fierce autumn storm rolled in from the sea, lashing the coast with torrential rain and gale-force winds. From his cottage, Alistair watched in horror as a section of her roof slates tore away, leaving a gaping hole. He knew she would never ask for help. The next morning, under a bruised and weeping sky, he arrived at her gate with 2 local laborers he had hired and paid 3 times their usual wage. Eleonora met him at the door, her face a storm cloud. "What is this?" she demanded. "Your roof is damaged," he stated simply, avoiding her gaze and looking at the hole. "These men will repair it." "I did not ask for your charity, Your Grace." "It is not charity. It is a debt," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "A small, insignificant payment on an account that can never be truly settled. Please, let us fix the roof, for the boy's sake, so he has a dry place to sleep." Mentioning Arthur was a calculated risk, but it was the only one he had. He saw the flicker of conflict in her eyes. Her pride warred with her maternal practicality. The cottage was cold and damp, and winter was coming. She gave a short, sharp nod, a concession that felt like a monumental victory. "Fine," she bit out, "but you will not set foot inside my house." He agreed immediately. He spent the day working alongside the men, passing slates, mixing mortar, his movements clumsy but determined. Eleonora watched them from the window for a time, then disappeared. Late in the afternoon, she emerged and left a tray on the stone wall. It held 3 steaming mugs of tea and a plate of thick-cut bread and cheese. She said nothing, retreating back inside immediately. But the gesture was thunderous. It was not forgiveness. It was not even acceptance. It was a crack, a tiny fissure in the wall of her anger. Alistair drank the tea, and it was the finest thing he had ever tasted. His most difficult task was presenting her with the proof of Marcus's betrayal. He couldn't force it on her. He had to wait for an opening. It came, unexpectedly, from Arthur. Alistair had taken to walking the cliff paths in the early mornings. One day he encountered Arthur, who was hunting for interesting pebbles on the beach below. The boy, seeing him, did not run. He simply watched him with those solemn, gray eyes. "My mother is sad," Arthur announced without preamble. Alistair's heart clenched. "Why do you say that?" "She looks at the sea," the boy said, picking up a smooth, gray stone. "She thinks I do not see, but her face is rainy." The childish description was devastatingly accurate. "You are the man from the locket," Arthur said, changing the subject with the abruptness of a child. "The portrait man." "Yes," Alistair said, his voice thick. "I suppose I am. Are you a friend of my mamma's?" The question was a minefield. "I would like to be," Alistair answered carefully. "We knew each other a very long time ago." That evening, he took the box of documents and left it on her doorstep. He attached a simple note. "For Arthur's sake, so he one day understands. You do not have to read them, but they are here if you choose to." He retreated to his cottage and waited. He did not see her for 2 days. The cottage remained dark, the curtains drawn. He was sick with the fear that he had pushed too hard, that he had driven her away for good. On the 3rd day, she emerged. She walked not to the garden, but down the path towards his cottage. He met her outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but the burning hatred was gone. In its place was a complicated, turbulent sea of emotions. She was holding the box. "I read them," she said, her voice quiet. He just nodded, unable to speak. "That artist, Mr. Farrington. He was a good man. He was painting a miniature of my mother for me, from an old locket. That is what we were discussing." She looked up at him, her gaze direct, searching. "You truly did not know?" "I knew nothing," he said, and the shame in his voice was a raw, open wound. "I was a proud, arrogant fool, Eleonora. I let my cousin play on my insecurities. on my fear that you could never truly be happy with a man like me. He fed me poison, and I drank it down willingly, because it confirmed my own worst fears. There is no excuse for what I did. None. But I need you to know that the man who sent you away is not the man standing before you now. That man was a blind idiot. I am trying to learn how to see." She was silent for a long moment, simply studying his face. She saw the changes, the new lines of strain around his eyes, the humility in his posture, the raw sincerity in his expression. "What do you want, Alistair?" she asked, using his name. It was not warm, but it was not a weapon either. "I want to earn the right to be his father," he said, his voice cracking. "I want to earn the right to be your friend. And if it is not too late, if there is any piece of the past left to salvage, I want to earn the right to be your husband again." He expected her to laugh, to scorn him. Instead, she just looked at the churning sea. "The man who was my husband is gone," she said softly. "I do not know the man who stands before me now." She turned to leave, then paused. "The back fence needs mending. The wood is by the shed." It was not a promise. It was not forgiveness. But it was a chance. It was, for the first time in 5 years, the barest glimmer of hope. With the proof now laid bare between them, the dynamic shifted. The fury in Eleonora was replaced by a deep, weary sorrow, and a cautious, fragile curiosity. She began to watch Alistair, not as an intruder, but as a puzzle she could not solve. She saw him rise at dawn to work, mending the fence, clearing a stubborn patch of land she had never been able to tame, his movements becoming more certain, his body leaner and harder. He never presumed. He never overstepped. He spoke to Arthur with a gentle respect that tore at her heart, answering the boys' incessant questions about stars and ships and the world beyond their small village. Alistair, for his part, had to return to Blackwood. He could not let Marcus's treachery stand. He told Eleonora he had to leave for a week, and he saw a flicker of the old fear in her eyes, the fear of abandonment. "I will be back," he promised, his gaze holding hers. "I swear it on my son's life." The oath was solemn, absolute. She believed him. His return to Blackwood was swift and brutal. He did not confront Marcus in private. He convened a dinner with his most influential relatives and neighbors, the very people who had whispered about Eleonora's disgrace 5 years ago. At the head of the table, with Marcus seated to his right, beaming with proprietary pride, Alistair stood up. In a cold, dispassionate voice, he laid out the entirety of his cousin's treason. He presented the evidence, the ledgers, the signed affidavit from the artist Farringdon, the stable boy's confession. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. Marcus's face went from ruddy to ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "You are no longer welcome in this house," Alistair declared, his voice ringing with the authority he had not properly wielded in years. "You are no longer a member of this family. Your name will be struck from the records. You will be provided with a small, yearly stipend, enough to keep you from starving, but not enough for you to show your face in decent society again. Now get out." Marcus was ruined, socially, financially, personally. It was a complete and utter annihilation, executed with surgical precision. Alistair then turned to the stunned assembly. "I have also come to announce that I have found my wife, the Duchess Eleonora. She has been living quietly these past years. The fault for her absence, and for the vicious slanders against her name, lies entirely with me. With my pride, and my unforgivable blindness, I will spend the rest of my days making amends. Let anyone who dares to speak a word against her answer to me." He left the next morning, leaving the scandal to fester and his reputation to be re-evaluated. He did not care what society thought of him. He cared only what one woman in a small cottage in Cornwall thought. When he returned, He found a fragile peace had settled. Eleonora had told Arthur that Alistair was his father. The boy accepted it with the simple logic of a child, as if it were a fact he had always known, but had not had a name for. He began to call him Papa, a word that both healed and broke Alistair's heart each time he heard it. The true turning point came during a sudden autumn fever that swept through the village. Arthur fell violently ill. His small body burned with heat, and he was lost in delirium. Eleonora was beside herself with terror, the strength she had cultivated for 5 years, crumbling in the face of her child's suffering. Alistair did not leave her side. For 2 days and 2 nights, they kept vigil together. He held Arthur's hand, bathed his forehead with cool cloths, and spoke to him in a low, soothing voice. He fetched water, kept the fire going, and was simply there, a solid, unwavering presence in the terrifying darkness. He saw Eleonora's fierce independence melt away to reveal the vulnerable, frightened mother beneath. He wasn't the Duke. She wasn't the wronged wife. They were just 2 parents, united in their fear for their child. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Arthur woke up, weak but lucid, and asked for a drink of water. The relief that washed over the small room was so profound, it was almost a physical force. Eleonora sagged against the wall, her face streaked with tears, completely spent. Alistair moved to her, gently taking her arm and leading her to a chair. He knelt before her, taking her chapped, work-worn hands in his. They were no longer the hands of a duchess, but they were the strongest, most beautiful hands he had ever seen. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We saved him," he corrected softly. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes, all pride and pretense stripped away. "Eleonora, I love you. I think I loved you even then. But I was too much of a coward and a fool to know what love was. It is not possession. It is not pride. It is this. It is sitting in the dark, terrified, together. I know I do not deserve you. I may never deserve you. But I will spend every day I have left trying." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at her sleeping son. She looked at this humbled, changed man kneeling on the rough floorboards of her cottage. The anger was gone. The bitterness had been washed away by shared fear and relief. In its place was something new, something tentative and fragile, but something real. "Alistair," she said, her voice clear and steady. She squeezed his hand. "Come home. Let us go home. Together." Their return to Blackwood was not a restoration of the old order, but the beginning of a new one. Eleonora walked back into the manor, not as a disgraced wife, but as its undisputed mistress. The staff, who had heard the tales of the Duke's public excoriation of his cousin, looked at her with a newfound awe and respect. She did not revert to her former life. She brought the lessons of Porthgera with her. She found the extravagant household accounts wasteful and reorganized them with the fierce pragmatism she had learned from counting every penny. She took an active interest in the tenant farms, walking the fields with Alistair. Her insights into crop rotation and soil health, learned from her own small patch of land, proving invaluable. She was no longer a decoration. She was a partner. Alistair, in turn, ceded control. He found that his wife's intelligence and strength were not a threat to his power, but a multiplier of it. He listened to her. He valued her opinion above all others. Their evenings were not spent in cavernous, silent dining rooms, but in the study with maps and ledgers spread before them, Arthur asleep upstairs, their minds working in unison. The house, once a cold and soulless monument, began to fill with warmth and laughter. Forgiveness was not a single event, but a daily process. There were still moments when a shadow of the past would cross her face, a reminder of the deep wound he had inflicted. In those moments, he would not offer excuses. He would simply reach for her hand, his eyes full of the sorrow and regret that would always be a part of him, and she would accept the silent apology. One bright summer afternoon, a year after their return, Alistair found her in the West Garden. It had been a formal, stuffy affair of pruned roses and rigid hedges. Now, under her direction, it was a riot of life. Wildflowers mingled with vegetables, herbs grew in fragrant patches, and the air hummed with the sound of bees. It was a garden that was both beautiful and useful, much like the woman who had designed it. Arthur was chasing a cabbage-white butterfly near a row of sunflowers, his laughter echoing in the warm air. Eleonora was kneeling, her hands in the dirt, a smudge of earth on her cheek. She looked up as he approached, and her smile was genuine, untroubled, reaching all the way to her eyes. He sat on the grass beside her, shedding his ducal jacket without a thought. The air smelled of damp soil, lavender, and sunshine. It was the smell of their new life. "I was thinking," she said, her fingers gently tending to a young tomato plant, "that we should build a small cottage for Mary here on the estate. She is getting old, and I would like her to be near." "An excellent idea," Alistair agreed, his heart swelling. He was not looking at the vast expanse of his lands, at the powerful stone manor that was his birthright. He was looking at his wife, her hands in the earth. He was looking at his son, a small, vibrant boy who was the living symbol of their second chance. He reached out, his hand covering hers in the rich, dark soil. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. The connection was solid, real, rooted in the earth. The peace they had found was not a fragile thing. It had been forged in betrayal, tempered by hardship, and earned through penance. It was strong. It would last.